Hello, and welcome to our presentation on pseudoscience and gifted education. My name is Dr. Hope E. Wilson, and our co-presenters are Dr. Erin Miller, Dr. Drilla Edelson, Dr. Kate Snyder, Dr. Matt Makel, Dr. Michael Matthews, and Dr. Scott Peters. I'm going to start our presentation. And each of us are going to explain our journeys in how we have come to learn about science and our misconceptions and how we've changed our views over time. So we're going to start. So I am going to go over a few of the things that I used to think and what I know now based upon my experiences and my research. So the first thing that I used to think, so you can see a picture of Journey, and I'm going to talk about my journey. So I used to think that color was invented sometime after Mr. Ed was on TV when I was a little girl. And then I had a Sunday school teacher who pointed out that Joseph and his amazing, colored robe and how that, maybe color was around when my parents were children as well. In college, I thought that Beowulf was a werewolf. And, maybe I should have actually read the textbook in college literature, and that would have, because I actually thought that until just a few weeks ago when it occurred to me that maybe it wasn't the case. So when I first started teaching, I had a female principal who was really ineffective, and I thought that, I generalized that case to all female principals and thought, female leadership was ineffective. And as I grew as a professional in education, as I learned more about myself and others, I realized that you can't generalize from one case. So just because I had one kind of terrible female principal didn't mean that all female principals were bad. And in fact, some of the best bosses and leaders that I've had in my life have been female and have been fabulous. So I really learned from that, not just that, female leadership is amazing, but also that I can't generalize just from one case. And finally, and this is maybe the most important and most relevant to this case, is that I used to kind of really believe that gifted kids who were underachieving were most likely, lazy, or they were just really bored by the curriculum, and we need to give them a greater challenge. That if I saw a kid who was underachieving, then the best case would be to give them something more challenging. But what I've learned is that when we see a child that is really underachieving, that isn't performing to the standards that we think they should, our very first consideration should be twice exceptionality. That may or may not be the case, but until we consider things like ADHD, anxiety, and depression, we could cause more harm than good. So we want to rule out anything that we could fix that might be an underlying cause to their underachievement. And once we know that they don't have ADHD, that they're not experiencing anxiety or depression, which those anxiety and depressions could be interacting with their environment, and that environment might be a high pressure environment that's causing lots of anxiety, or it could be they could be having stress and depression because the environment isn't challenging enough. But we need to address those emotional concerns first, and then we can, or in combination with the curricular concerns, but we need to consider that twice exceptionality for the well-being of the child. And when we don't do that, we run the risk of increased suicide among our gifted children, and that is a much more serious case and an important consideration. So we need to provide the help that we can to children first. So those are my considerations and what I used to think and what I know now. So I'd like to move on and see what our other presenters are going to think.
Hi everyone, I'm Kate Snyder. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Hanover College, and I'm here to talk to you about my debunking journey. And so as I was putting together what I wanted to talk about today, thinking about my path as being someone who's known for debunking misconceptions and attacking pseudoscience and gifted education, it reminded me about those memes that are currently going around about how it started and how it's going. And so if I think about how it started, I think about myself as a freshman at North Carolina State University, who was a zoology major at the time, taking an educational psychology class. And I remember going to the professor's office hours and really excited. I really wanted to talk to him about all these things I'd heard from my educator mother, about Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, and when were we going to learn about that in the class? Probably a little bit about learning styles, and I was really excited to do a project on overexcitabilities in gifted students. And after I became a psychology major, I actually did my research methods project looking at differences on an overexcitabilities measure between people or students who had been previously identified as gifted and those who hadn't. And I didn't find much, which my freshman self was a little confused by. But that's really how it started. It started as someone who was really excited to take these things that she had heard about and that felt real to her and consider them for research. And then when I consider how it's going, the other side of the meme, I am now kind of informally and famously known for attacking pseudoscience and debunking misconceptions. Students in my classes, I teach human development classes, always talk about my classes as one where your world sort of melts down and you realize everything you thought you knew, you didn't actually know. And even just yesterday, we were having a discussion on word learning and motor development, and one of my students said, oh, this is like learning styles that we always learn about in our education classes. And I had to break the news again, that no, that's not actually a thing. And so when I think about this process, my own personal journey in misconceptions, going from someone who had them to someone who actively works to debunk them in her teaching and her research, I really became fascinated with and fell in love with the process of letting go of old ideas and taking on new ideas. And so I think for one of the things we talk about for debunking, not just for ourselves, but for others, we talk a lot about letting go of ideas. We don't talk enough about taking on new ideas. And so debunking is most effective when you give people something to replace the old idea that they have. And it's in modeling the process, I don't want to give the impression, especially not to my students, that I no longer have misconceptions. I do, I just don't know them yet. And it's always thinking about, well, do I have misconceptions based on knowledge that has not yet been presented to me, or maybe even that things that haven't been tested yet. So always keeping myself open to changing my ideas. And I think that's what makes it really effective. And from a teaching standpoint, that's what makes it especially effective, is when we model the process for our students and we talk about how uncomfortable it is to let go of old ideas. And I'm thinking back and I can't actually remember when I learned about overexcitabilities not being supported by research. I can't remember when I learned that learning styles weren't supported by research. But one specific example that comes to mind is for a few semesters, I had been teaching students about the effectiveness of using handheld concrete manipulatives in math learning. And I remember emailing back and forth with a colleague about something she was doing for an upcoming job talk. And she said that she was going to present on the research that has been around since the 90s, and I just hadn't seen it yet, showing that those handheld concrete manipulatives aren't as effective for math learning as we thought. And I remember my heart kind of dropping and my stomach got this real uncomfortable feeling. And I realized that what I thought was the case was not actually the case. And so rather than step away from that discomfort and say, oh, that research must be wrong, or that doesn't, like match up with what I thought, sort of leaning into that discomfort and being like, oh, I hadn't actually seen that research and please tell me more. And so kind of embracing that conceptual change process. And so that brings me to my final point, and one that I always try to emphasize with my students is that just because we are researchers, we cannot escape these biases. There's nothing special that dismisses us from the bounds of flawed reasoning. We can work to improve that and work to always contrast new knowledge, new information with what we thought we knew, so that we're not subject to pseudoscience or misconceptions. But just because we are researchers, we can't fully escape these biases. And so I think a big theme for me, especially as I reflect back on how it started, how it's going, is the theme of humility. So not being overly critical of people who still hold misconceptions, but really considering how we can be more effective in debunking this pseudoscience. So thank you for letting me share my personal journey today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Erin Miller. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Bridgewater College in Virginia. And I came into the field of gifted ed as an undergraduate psych major entering graduate school. I was initially enthralled with the idea of overexcitabilities and Dabrowski's writings. They seemed to resonate with me because I was all those things. Everything that Dabrowski talked about related to overexcitabilities, like I was that kid, I was that girl. Even to the extent that in one of my graduate classes, I was called to the front as example A of someone who has overexcitabilities, as we discussed Dabrowski. I had no tags in my clothes, and I talked about all the things that I was sensitive to, both physically and emotionally, and lots of different things like that, as it has resonated with a lot of people. But as I studied it more, and as new research came forward, it became clear that Dabrowski really wasn't describing gifted children per se, and gifted adults, that there was probably better explanations. The more established psychological dimensions of the big five, personality factors, particularly openness to experience, seemed to better capture some of the dimensions that resonated with me as far as overexcitabilities went. There's also the fact that Dabrowski, positive disintegration and overexcitabilities is not a mainstream psychological theory. And the reason for that is that there are theories that better predict behavior and better explain what is going on. The other factor is that there's much more diversity in the population of children that are gifted than is captured by some of those concepts that Dabrowski put forward. There are plenty of children and adults who are characterized as gifted. They have the necessary cognitive abilities, but overexcitabilities and those kinds of concepts really doesn't capture them at all. And so it does capture some people, but it's not an overarching theory to explain what's going on in the social, emotional, and personality development of gifted children. Part of where I think people struggle is a cognitive fallacy called the jingle jangle fallacy, which is basically saying that just because you give something a different name doesn't mean that the concept is different, or just because two concepts have the same name, that they're necessarily the same thing. So part of the difficulty is that people like to hold on to certain terms, that those terms make sense to them, and that it's difficult to see that another construct actually captures all aspects of the constructs, such as overexcitabilities and positive disintegration. And things such as Hexaco and the big five personality factors are better at explaining. And that's why you don't see a lot of Dabrowski in mainstream psychology. It's because there are theories that better capture what is going on. So that has been my journey from being enamored with the theories of Dabrowski to seeing that scientifically and as far as utility, that there are some better concepts and better constructs and better theories that are going to be more useful for us. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Drilla Edelson, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk about what we used to believe and what we know now, both as a field and as individuals. Although a gifted education researcher and consultant now, I began my career as a self-contained gifted and talented fourth grade teacher. My origin story dates back to when I was an undergraduate studying elementary education. My professors required that we indicate on each lesson plan an accommodation we would make. Among the reasons for accommodations were to meet different students' learning styles or multiple intelligences. So I would write what I thought was an engaging lesson plan using best practices, and then also write an accommodation for a specific learning style, such as auditory or kinesthetic. Once I became a teacher, I realized how this did not work in practice. There was not a reliable method that allowed valid inferences to determine which student had what learning style. Moreover, I found that when I was teaching well, I was teaching using multiple modalities and engaging all students. Very quickly, I eliminated this accommodation from my thinking. It wasn't until later, as a graduate student and then professor, that I started to become aware of the research out there about these theories and others. What my journey has taught me is multifaceted. First, we must remember that educational psychology is a science. Researchers put forth theories and hypothesize about how students learn. We must rigorously test those theories. Moreover, we must examine how those theories are applied to practice. In general, how does what we know through research translate into the classroom? And how is it being translated? Then we must research what are the limitations, the successes, the drawbacks of applying those theories in the classroom, and does application support or refute the theory? Finally, as educators and researchers, we have to remember that science evolves, and we cannot simply trust what we thought we knew years ago, but must be aware of what new research has emerged.
Hi, my name is Matt Makel, and today I'll be talking about pseudoscience, open science, and how to make research more trustworthy. Back when I was in grad school, my dissertation built on the work of Carol Dweck's mindset research, where mindsets are a person's belief about whether or not ability is fixed or can be improved. She found that mindset influences motivation and performance, but more importantly, she found that with a small manipulation, she can change a person's mindset into believing that their ability can be improved, which led to better performance, which is a big deal. That's a huge goal in education. For my dissertation, I wanted to see if I could replicate her work in the domain of creativity. Now, this was important because one of the most common myths in creativity is that it's fixed and cannot be changed, but not a lot of research had looked at whether or not those beliefs were malleable. And so my dissertation question was to see whether or not I could extend Dweck's work from ability into creativity. Now, I want to be clear, I was replicating Dweck's work because I believed in her results. I felt that I would be able to replicate her results, but I didn't. I failed, and essentially nothing worked. And my initial reaction was that it was my fault and that maybe I was a bad researcher. And this is where I connect it to pseudoscience. I'm definitely not asserting that Carol Dweck's research is pseudoscience, although I do think that the evidence suggests that maybe our ability to change performance is pretty small in general, and that it's probably not one of the bigger effects that we should be focusing on in education. But what I think is relevant are three connections: replication, generalizability, and overcoming our personal desires. So first, replication. I believe that to be a real scientific finding, that independent researchers must be able to replicate the results. If a finding is so fragile that others cannot replicate it, should we really be basing our classroom practices on that particular finding? I do not think so. The second connection is generalizability. A finding may be true in one setting for one group of students, but may not generalize to your setting with your students. So asking whether or not an intervention works is not really the answer that we want. or is the question that we want answered. What we want answered is, when does an intervention work? For whom does it work? And I think answering more questions like that will get us the answers that we actually want and will be relevant for our practice. This takes me to my third and final connection. Our demand and desire for evidence is always going to be greater than the amount of evidence available, because as soon as we learn one thing, we want to learn the next thing, and taking time to collect data is going to always lag behind our desire to have the answers. And so in education, we're just constantly yearning to know what's next and to have some magic wand that will give us the answers and the solutions that we seek. And I worry that sometimes we're like Charlie Brown being tricked by Lucy, where she pulls the football away at the last second in order for him to miss the kick and miss the kicking the football. So yes, we must maintain our desire for effective solutions, but we must not let that desire cloud our judgment as we assess the evidence of whether a given intervention works in our particular context. So I just want to recap 3 big points that I'd like you to remember. 1, please don't let your desire for something to work cloud your judgment about whether or not it's working or we have evidence that it's working. 2, just because something works in one setting does not mean that it will work for you in your particular setting. And 3rd, knowing whether a finding can be replicated can really tell you whether or not it's trustworthy science.
Hi, I'm Michael Matthews, and I'm a professor of gifted education at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and co-editor of Gifted Child Quarterly. I'd like to share with you this morning a brief story in which some research findings led to more accurate statements about students identified as gifted. So the beginning of this story is back when I was a high school science teacher. I had a couple students who I thought were particularly interesting because they weren't getting from their school experiences the things that the other teachers and I thought they should. One was a 9th grader, and he was clearly a talented artist and also an English learner. He spent the whole class with a pencil and paper, and he was working, it looked like, except instead of taking notes like his classmates, he was spending the entire time in class drawing. I thought his drawings were really good, but when I asked him about his classwork, he just shrugged and said that his family wanted him to get a job. And soon thereafter, he stopped coming to school, and unfortunately, I never heard from him again. I had another student who was in my chemistry class, this time an 11th grader. He also never took notes, but he always sat quietly reading a thick fiction book in class. And even though it looked like he wasn't paying attention, whenever I called on him or asked him something, he knew the answer to whatever I asked about the chemistry content. He made a passing grade in the course, mostly because he could always manage to get a low A on his tests, but I never saw him turn in any homework, and he hardly ever turned in his lab reports. So to make a long story short, I talked to other teachers and counselors about these students, and they didn't really have much to offer as far as what I could do for them. So these experiences led me then to begin my add-on licensure coursework in gifted education. And when I started reading, I kept running across this interesting statement that said 20% of high school dropouts are gifted. That's 1 in 5, and that would mean that gifted students were wildly overrepresented among dropouts. In graduate school, I then had a chance to read more about this, and I learned that the figure in question apparently came from a misreading of a statement in the Marland report, which in turn was using data from the state of Iowa, WISC scores in this case, that were already a few decades old when the Marland report was published in the 1970s. So it struck me as not very surprising that a lot of people in 1950s Iowa probably left school early for a whole variety of different reasons, whether or not they had been identified as gifted. I also ran across a study by Park and Renzulli that reported a giftedness rate among dropouts of around 1.4%, but their study used a really broad definition of giftedness that included over 25% of the overall student population as gifted. A few years later, after I graduated, I was working as a research fellow at Duke TIP, and I was able to put together a study to look at this question with some more current data. So I combined records of students who had participated in the TIP talent search testing, which included about half of all the gifted learners in North Carolina. And I was able to combine those with state level dropout data from North Carolina. And guess what? No matter which of the different ways that dropouts were defined, and there are several ways they're counted, the proportion who were gifted was still well below 1% of the overall dropout population. Very different from 20%. I published this work in Roper Review in 2006, and I wrote a related chapter about it in 2009. And over the following years, I also shared this work with people and websites wherever I saw the 20% figure repeated. A few of these places wrote back and told me that they updated their writing to remove the outdated information. And that was really exciting to me. So I'm pleased to say now, today, that I haven't seen the statement 20% of dropouts are gifted since probably around 2012. This gives me hope because people were willing to make this small change to represent a more accurate view based on data. I think this means that we can also make progress on other areas of pseudoscience that keep cropping up in our field today. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Scott Peters and I am a professor of assessment and research design at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I'm also currently the NAGC Association Editor. And my personal story with pseudoscience is probably kind of a controversial topic in that a number of years ago I was working on a book with several other of my colleagues called Beyond Gifted Education, and I also wrote an article for EdWeek, the title being something along the lines of Gifted Education is crucial, but the label isn't. And what I really argued for in that article is that challenging kids is critical, that providing advanced learning services for kids who are ready for more is critical, but that there isn't really a lot of evidence that identifying students as gifted and having this specific field and this specific type of intervention called a gifted intervention actually helps us accomplish that goal. So if you just think about any of the conversations you've had where you've talked about gifted education, you then had to explain what it means and how it's not really elitist and it doesn't really mean this, it just means providing challenge and meeting the needs of students where they are. I ran into this barrier where I realized there wasn't really any evidence saying that having gifted education, having it exist as a specific field and having services called gifted education actually was facilitating more kids being challenged. And I kind of put that out there and everyone in the world kind of got pretty upset with me. There were a lot of response articles written about it that said, oh, without these services, these kids wouldn't be challenged. But again, that led me back to what evidence is there? What science is there that by calling it gifted education and by labeling the kids as gifted or not gifted, that the result is more kids being challenged and appropriately served in school than if we either called it something else or didn't have it at all. And my concern is that it might actually be hindering us because the term can be misleading. It can put people off and it can make people think we're talking about something that we're not. So that was the first time I really had to deal with this idea of, is there evidence behind a very long held belief in the field? And if not, maybe we should consider changing it. So there's my little story about pseudoscience. Hope it's helpful.